Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Week of Summit, and welcome to our panel this morning or afternoon, depending where you're joining us from, focused on unity and bridging divides. My name is Anna Fink. I'm the Executive Director of the Amalgamated Foundation, and I'm really pleased to be here today and excited to moderate this panel with some pretty incredible folks. Let me just start with a little bit of an intro on how I came to this work and what we're going to be talking about today, and then I'm going to open it up for our panelists. I know this conference has had multiple sessions tackling questions around polarization at this moment, and it has never been more apparent to me personally how critical this work is at this time and how important it is for people engaged at any level, from grassroots to major donors to institutions, to think about our responsibility and our role. And that's why we have set up this panel to specifically talk about some really important work happening in various different ways as people think about how to grapple with and really stand up in courageous ways to think about bridging divides and taking action on that front. My own entree into this work, which I think creates a direct link to the important work each of you are probably doing in the audience, it makes that link. I run the Amalgamated Foundation, where we partner with individuals through donor advised funds, as well as institutional philanthropists through pooled funds to resource social change work and to move more resources to support social change. In 2019, we were a very new donor advised fund provider and manager, just really a year old, when I started seeing reports and data coming out tracking gifts to hate groups from anonymous gifts from donor advised funds in the tens of millions of dollars. I knew that this was something that we wanted to make sure never happened at the Amalgamated Foundation. And I felt that I myself and our organization, based on our values and legacy as an institution founded by immigrant workers, had a responsibility to stand up. So we created a call to action, a collective call to action called Hate is Not Charitable. And to date, we have over 100 charitable institutions who've signed on to this effort, representing billions in assets, all of whom have pledged to ensure that their institutions and their funds do not resource hate groups or hate work. And this work has really put us in conversation. We've fielded calls for support and guidance from community foundations, from financial institutions, from private foundations, individual donors, as well as advocates and journalists working to better understand this issue. So I'm really pleased to be moderating this panel today with a set of leaders, each of whom are taking action in their own critical and courageous ways and are excited to share their stories with you. So I'm just going to start by asking each panelist to go around and tell us a little about yourself and how you came to this work, and in what ways your work is bridging divides. And I'll start with Libby.
Thanks so much, Anna. I'm really happy to be here with all of you today. Just want to say thank you for showing up. That's often the first step. So my name is Libby Stegger. I'm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm the founder and executive director of an initiative called Move for America. Our mission is designed to catalyze a generation of leaders skilled in bridging divides. I came to this work, I've been really inspired by the growing number of initiatives here in Minnesota and around the country that are addressing our partisan polarization and thinking about political systems change. And I really admire these projects. But I've also borne witness to the power of everyday people coming together for change. We've absolutely seen that here in the Twin Cities and around the country and around the globe, especially in this last year. And I believe that in a democracy that the collective dialogue that we have is as important as the debates in the halls of Congress. Our political ecosystem, it feeds off of this national narrative, right? It is not just about our politicians making decisions on our behalf, but is really about them taking their cues from us as well. And right now, that narrative is about division. I think about our everyday lives, even my own. I've often opted to live in a bubble with people who agree with me, who might share my culture or my worldview. Maybe we're avoiding conflicting conversations with friends or neighbors, maybe even in our own family. Or maybe we're having those conversations, but they're often explosive. And I just don't believe it has to be that way. So at Move for America, we're committed to helping people get outside of their bubbles with the intention to learn, to seek to understand alternative perspectives, different worldviews, and to really seek common ground. So we're particularly focused on young people at Move for America. We're looking at college-age students and recent graduates, and these are young leaders who are often deeply committed to service, but they've grown up in a world of both division on one hand and also major movements for social change, both locally and around the world. And they're hungry for that change, but the older generations, my generation included, we're not consistently modeling a way to productively engage in dialogue and to really value diverse perspectives. And so what we do is we create opportunities for young adults to move across the urban-rural divide and to practice their bridging skills. We offer training and also placement in community-based organizations where they can learn and practice those skills. It's kind of like a study abroad right here in our own country. And I'm just really grateful to be here and part of the panel today. John, Abbas, and Anna, they are really visionary leaders in this space, and just really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Libby. Jonathan, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks, Anna. Great to be with you all. I'm John Gruber. I'm with Einhorn Collaborative, which is a family foundation based in New York that works nationally to support a range of efforts that help people build strong relationships, embrace our differences, and see our shared humanity. And that work is anchored in a recognition, as Libby described, that our dominant culture today reinforces just the opposite, reinforces division, distrust, dehumanization, disconnection. And so our work has been, from a funder perspective, trying to strengthen a culture in which it is more the norm to prioritize and invest in human connection, to reach across the various divides and fault lines that are so pernicious in American life, and to support organizations, researchers, leaders who are doing that work in really creative and rigorous ways. I think from our standpoint, after the 2016 election, we decided to delve more deeply into supporting bridging work, recognizing that there was a really vibrant ecosystem of actors already doing work in various ways, dating back decades. And yet it was a galvanizing moment of sorts, given the level of toxic polarization and distrust that was laid bare during that highly divisive moment. And we also saw that in philanthropy, most of the funding was flowing, especially in the 2017, 2018 timeframe, toward other crucial imperatives to strengthen and repair democracy, whether that was institutional, structural reforms, work to protect marginalized and vulnerable groups, work to fight disinformation and misinformation, extremist content, and yet not as much focus, philanthropically speaking, on supporting this growing body of organizations helping to bring people together across differences. And so that became more of a focus of ours a few years ago. And fast forward to where we are now, we're in a moment where we're trying to actually work more collaboratively with other funders, with an eclectic, diverse mix of funders to try to model and embrace some of the bridging norms and values in how we show up as funders, as we also support that work out in the world. So happy to share more about that as the conversation progresses. Really excited to be with you.
Great, thank you. And Abbas, tell us how you come
Hi
to
there.
this work.
Will do. It's a pleasure to be here, everybody. And, thinking about the kinds of work that Jonathan and Libby just shared, I guess the best way to frame my work is, how do we think about the consequences of the polarization that we've all described at the policy level? So really the problems that we have in media that we see on a kind of community basis, how do they translate in sort of institutional settings? And that's been my concern for about 5 or 6 years now. I wear a couple of different professional hats. I straddle the world of academia and practitioner advocacy. And what I found is that basically the first step of bridging divides for me came in my personal and professional life. I wasn't satisfied with the kind of impact that we were not making in academia. I felt that we had a tremendous amount of thought leadership and brain power, but that it simply was not being applied. And then I found that in practitioner and policy settings, they lacked the sort of space and capacity to be able to think through constructively about some certain issues and just simply carve out time and space to have difficult conversations that are research-based. And so a few years ago, in a number of different capacities, I began modeling what I would call a cross-sector research-based dialogue model whereby we bring practitioners from different settings, experts from different settings to come together and really tackle problems that don't seem to have an immediate fix. This was everything from refugee resettlement programming to extremism and radicalization and the consequences of counterterrorism and counter-extremism work on vulnerable communities. And along the way, I've had a chance to work with some amazing partners. And so the latest iteration of our work and that method is at the Horizon Forum, which is housed at the Proteus Fund and sponsored in part with the work of Anna Fink at the Amalgamated Foundation, and really building upon the great work of That Hate Is Not Charitable. We focus specifically on working with grant-making institutions and community foundations to address the issue of hate funding. Believe it or not, you get the same tax benefit for donating to a food bank as you would to a hate group that has the ability to operate underneath the status of a charity or a 501c3 educational institution, which is really a horrendous gap in our regulatory and sort of legal framework. So what we do is we work quietly in this kind of discrete cross-sector setting to bring out best practices and to also sort of educate and engage with foundations. And so again, what are the consequences of polarization at the policy level, and how might we use different tools to solve that? It's been really exciting and valuable work, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great, thank you. And I'd love to now jump into a little bit of storytelling from each of you. And I'd just like to do for the next go round for you each to share one of the biggest challenges you see in the work you do and an example that inspires you or that you sort of think might in some ways could be a model for bridging divides and moving forward. And, I think you've each shared some really compelling just thoughts on the framing around this work and the importance of it, and would love to dig into some specific stories and examples for this next round. Why don't we go around in the same order again, and starting with Libby.
Great, yeah, stories really capture what the essence of what this is. And one of the biggest challenges that I see in this work is it's not some big macro, it's internal, right? We all are agents of change, and often don't see ourselves as that. It feels, polarization in particular feels really big, really hard to tackle. It often feels far away. It might feel like it's in Washington, D.C., or it's in the halls of your legislature, or somewhere else. And it feels hard to get our arms around. And so I think one of the biggest challenges we face is seeing ourselves both as part of often the problem and the solution. So I think about even my own experience. I often saw myself as someone who was open-minded and was able to bridge divides and learn about and connect to people of all walks of life. As we careened toward this most recent election in 2020, I was feeling myself increasingly polarized. And so, could feel that happening and making some, ill-informed assumptions about people and their beliefs and their values based on perhaps their voting habits or where they live, right? And these are things that we need to interrogate when we feel them happening in ourselves, and we can do work to see that in ourselves and to interrupt it. And then we can take that out into community. So some really inspiring examples that have brought me into this work have been from young people who are stepping up and stepping into that space. I think about one of the Move for America fellows who's coming on board in our summer program, who as a high school student saw what was happening in his community, was feeling the polarization following the 2016 election, and decided to do something about it. And he and a small group of his high school classmates established a partnership with a school across state lines. So they were living in an urban center, and they connected with a school across state lines in a more rural community that was very different than their own. And they facilitated an exchange just between themselves. They went to live in each other's communities for a couple weeks. They got to know each other personally. They didn't have an agenda. They didn't have a specific thing that they were doing. They just went to go and get to know each other and have established those trusting relationships that last to this day. I think about another one of our fellows. He said, I'm really interested in academia and academic research, and how can I put my experience living in a sort of a metro area surrounded by many smaller towns and not really knowing about how to navigate those differences? How can I apply my academic research to this? And he published a chapter in a book as a young high schooler, right? I think about, there are young people here in Minneapolis today who are organizing people around the state around an issue that's really close to their hearts. They found themselves to be here in Minnesota. They lost their income as a direct result of the pandemic. But because of a policy here in Minnesota, they were unable to access unemployment benefits because of their age. They found that this was impacting people across the board, and they started to go around the state and learn from people who were impacted by this policy and get people together to make a change because they were supporting their families through the pandemic. So these are some of those everyday examples of ways that people are taking impacts in their own lives, things that they're seeing in everyday life, and doing something about it. And it doesn't take massive systems change, but when we all as individuals can show up and bring people together, it actually collectively can have a massive impact.
Libby, I love that example. And I think that speaks to one of the challenges that I perceive around bridging work, which is a set of misperceptions about what bridging work is about or what it can enable. I encounter a lot of skepticism that bridging requires skirting uncomfortable topics and preserving the status quo and sacrificing deeply held beliefs, that there's all of these assumptions about what the work is and isn't. And yet so much of the bridging work that we have been a part of and been able to support is just the opposite. It is rigorous, it is courageous, it invites people to bring moral clarity and passion to engagement across divides. One example that comes to mind is the work of Millennial Action Project. So speaking of the role of young people in this work. So MAP's mission is to bring together millennial age elected state legislators and legislatures across the country. They also work in Congress. And the first goal is simply to help these folks across the aisle build relationships, get to know one another as human beings, in the service of then working toward shared agendas for action on issues of concern to their constituents. MAP in Wisconsin, one of the most politically polarized states in the country, hosted a series of red and blue dialogues with state legislators who are part of the local future caucus from Republican and Democratic side, deeply engaging with constituents over a series of conversations across 6 months, taking up topics like clean energy, workforce development, urban planning, issues that deeply affected people's lives day to day, and bringing them into conversation with one another, recognizing some of the faulty assumptions people had about the other side, finding ways to frame issues in a more inviting and expansive way to then work toward shared solutions that some of these elected leaders then brought forward as bipartisan policy reforms that they advanced at the state legislature. So that's just one example of many that I think speak to how this work can be concrete, it can be courageous, and also deeply grounded in authentic human connection.
Those are great examples.
That's a great, these are great examples. And I love the point that you just made, Jonathan, about this being actually very rigorous work and that dialogue requires rigor. I'd like to share a story around how we've navigated some of the challenges. And I'd say that the biggest challenge in our space is trust building. Without the lack of interface, between the humans behind institutional philanthropy, right? I mean, there are actual human beings that are sitting at institutional philanthropy. There's actual human beings working in government agency or in advocacy organizations. And it's sort of creating an environment of trust in the middle, a kind of island of trust in the middle of this polarized context, right? Because you might only encounter or hear about one another through news media or through advocacy campaigns, and you might presume that you can't come to an agreement or you can't really tackle these issues. But in a carefully curated setting, I believe that the real change makers can be brought forth by providing a safe space. I liken it to what track 2 diplomacy might look like in international affairs, right? Like, how is it that you create this environment of trust? And what we found is that through select relationships, and again, centering human relationships here, through select relationships and mutual trust building, it really has a ripple effect, so much so that somebody that might be on the defensive can come forward and say, okay, we do have a problem at our foundation here that we don't really know how to get out of. And we want to be able to work with you or work with others and share those stories so we can come up with long-term solutions. And so what I have found is that being proactive about sending out those signals will communicate to others that you do have a sort of safe landing pad. And the one story that I'll offer is that there was an organization in Chicago that was published as funding some problematic organizations, and we discreetly, in another capacity, had just produced a large database that showed some of these flows, these funding flows. And what we had done is we reached out to many of the leaders that were on, many of the organizations that were on that list well ahead of time and said, listen, we're publishing this information. We know that you're not deliberately funding a hate group, but this is a problem that you're going to need to sort of or you're going to want to address. And they understood that we had to publish it because that's the nature of our work. And they respected that. And they came to our summits and our meetings, and they said, even if it was $1 that went to a hate group, we want to be able to track it and we want to be able to tackle it. And we don't care how hard this is, we're going to fix it. And in the meantime, we thought this was just a multi-billion-dollar foundation that didn't really care and was donor-centric and was just going to kind of run roughshod over this problem. But by sending out those signals and having intermediaries of human relationships that can serve as trust messengers, we were able to build that space. And thankfully, it has just rippled out, and we hope to be able to impact the larger sector. But it does require expanding and growing that island, if you will.
Thank you. Thank you all. These are such inspiring examples. And I think you've all touched on something really important around just the importance of sort of human relationships at the center of this work. And given that this conference and probably many people in the audience are members of giving circles, I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about ways that you think giving circles can address this issue in their own work and in their own space, maybe even in their own local or regional community.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. Yeah, I'm happy to kick that off as I think about the power of giving circles is really to start with your group, right? Start thinking about are you engaging with diverse and divergent ideas within your own group? Are you having those conversations? Are there people that are part of your group and your community who bring different perspectives to the table, and are you leaning into those? So really start with that dialogue between each other. It doesn't have to be this macro change. It can be just about the relational dialogue between you all, and inviting others to be a part of that conversation. It can then also be about asking questions in your community about who is leading in these spaces. So I think about here in the Twin Cities, if we ask a couple questions, who's leading in bridging spaces, who's doing things in a way that honors and values divergent perspectives. And I can rattle off 5 different organizations who are doing that incredibly well right here. And so as you're thinking about your funding, it doesn't have to be exclusively in bridging work, but in areas that you care passionately about, who's doing that in a way that's bridging divides, and really seeking out and prioritizing those groups. And those are some of the places I think of to start. I'm curious what the other panelists think.
Yeah, I love all those ideas, Libby. And I think one observation that we've had as a foundation that works nationally, that cares a lot about bridging work, it's true that there are many national organizations doing great work in this space, and yet the on-the-ground work really happens in local communities and in local settings, whether that's campuses, other educational settings, civic spaces. And so for those involved with giving circles who have an interest in supporting community level work, I think in addition to Libby's idea that, see who are the people with trust and influence and an inclination to engage in bridging like behavior around issues that people care about locally, and coupling that with learning about some of the organizations that may work regionally or nationally that have a presence and have an ability to provide programmatic support, provide tools, resources to local leaders to be able to advance work of different kinds. So there's some bridging work that takes the form mostly of helping people break bread, build relationships, get to know one another, perhaps surface shared values, shared interests, and that work can be really powerful. There's also models out there that help people move toward collaborative problem solving and shared action on issues. There's models that also have a more sophisticated approach to taking up some of the most divisive and fraught issues of the day in really authentic and deliberate ways. So I think there's a range of models out there, many national organizations who are eager to support and partner with communities and folks on the ground who have the rootedness and the trust and the wherewithal to actually do the work well. So that's, I think, a lens to keep in mind. And just to reinforce Libby's other point that giving circles naturally lend themselves to engaging in bridging like behavior and thinking as you might support this work out in the world. And that doesn't require that you have the most diverse representation of voices and identities and backgrounds within the group. Even in a giving circle that brings people together around a shared sense of identity, there's of course divergence of views and stances on issues and ways of coming into conversation. So the kind of deliberation and shared decision making that giving circles enable really lends itself to living this work.
Yeah, I would just really amplify and echo both what Libby and Jonathan have already said here. And if there's anything to add from my perspective, it would simply be, the kind of researcher in me really just finds the giving circle space and the community foundation space and the kind of place-based grant maker space as an invaluable civil society institution that I think, frankly, from a research perspective and from a sort of impact perspective, hasn't been fully documented. And I would just say that I would challenge giving circles and grant making institutions to think through what kind of infrastructure could you build as far as public reporting is concerned. And there are ways to just build in, I'm a big fan of small research briefs. They can be anonymized. They can still secure kind of what the integrity of giving circles and a lot of the discretion that's involved in the funding space. You can still anonymize that work and report out about it, because when other stakeholders in our community realize that this is where this sector of thought leaders and practice leaders, this is where they're headed, it can have an impact. So what kind of infrastructure, research-based or reporting infrastructure, could we build out so that that learning gets disseminated to larger audiences and can provide a kind of feedback loop to amplify and strengthen our work, and then also connect regionally, because the regional grant making associations would love to hear about this kind of work. And just that building out that sort of infrastructure and connectivity, I think, is something that's going to accelerate the impact that giving circles can have and are already making.
Great. Well, I have a lot more questions that I'm eager to dive into, but I want to open it up to the audience here and see if anybody who's part of the audience has either a question or a comment that they'd like to share. And you can feel free to pop those in the chat and I'll read them out. I think that is the best form for this. I don't think we're doing live Q&A. So let us know any questions that you all have. I'm gonna just give it 1 second, and then if not, I'm gonna keep going with my own set of questions, and also ask our panelists to just invite you all, if you have questions for each other, to type up as well. Great. So could you speak to any bridging work you have seen that addresses intergenerational community building? John, I'm wondering, you were talking about that millennial legislator project, and I was thinking about intergenerational connections as you were talking there. So I wonder if you want to start with that question.
Sure. Yeah, Millennial Action Project is one interesting example in that there is a lot of generational diversity in many legislative bodies across the country, and some of the most powerful relationships that have been built through that network have a kind of mentor-mentee flavor to them, and in the way that some more seasoned members of these legislative bodies have kind of taken some of the younger folks under their wing, and it goes two-way though, however, right? Like part of the vision of Millennial Action Project is premised on research about millennials as a generational cohort and bringing a kind of combination of pragmatism and passion to their work and a solutions orientation, and that's why they've seen a lot of powerful impact in terms of the kind of shared work and projects that people have undertaken. One more specific example of intergenerational bridging is an organization we know well called Encore.org, and Encore basically developed a new way of thinking about the latter decades of life, sort of age 60 plus, naming this notion of an encore career, an encore chapter. And Mark Friedman, the founder, had observed that there was this kind of problematic way in which later life got defined as graying, as playing, and focused on retirement and leisure and so forth. And yet so many adults at that stage of life, even if they are perhaps ramping down from their core career, have such a remarkable store of wisdom and talent, and also a inborn sort of inclination to want to pay it forward and nurture the next generation. And so Encore developed a model around helping Encore adults, Encore talent, plug into social impact experiences, as they were calling them, second acts for the greater good. And the focus of Encore in recent years has shifted even more so to fostering intergenerational and multi-generational bridging and engagement. They've done that in a range of ways, supporting various nonprofits and social entrepreneurs who are devising new models for connecting the generations, in lifting up and recognizing people who are living this kind of intergenerational way through prizes and innovation campaigns and other programming. So I think that's one of the most promising models out there. And I love the question because the intergenerational divide is real, and yet it also feels like one of the most bridgeable divides, in that all young people eventually become older people. And there's that sense of empathy and relatability that flows down generations. And there is such a complementarity too, in terms of the talent, the needs, the aspirations that older and younger generations can bring to bear in engaging with one another. So I just really appreciate you raising that in a conversation more broadly about bridging.
Great. Those are great examples. I love hearing about Encore. Very cool. Did anybody else want to respond to that? And let me just say again to the audience, don't be shy.
Yeah, I'm glad that John chimed in, because he had some really concrete, tangible tangible examples. And I can add that I appreciate the question so much, because I think the examples that come to mind for me are ones in which mentorship is really built into youth-based organizations, and that is a mutual mentorship, right? So thinking, we often have this traditional idea of mentorship as being sort of like the older generation is teaching younger people how to do something, and it's most powerful when it can be happening always, right? Where we can all learn from each other, and I think we have work to do to build in intergenerational dialogue as a core part of our bridging work. And a core practice. And so I appreciate you raising it here. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to ask another question that maybe gets more at a sort of challenge. I think one of the questions is, as I've been doing this work, one of the real challenges that comes up is around free speech versus hate speech, and really sort of thinking about how we build a big tent and invite people in, and at the same time create accountability around some of the real harms that have been done and that are continuing to happen in communities across the country. And I'm curious how each of you address that in your work and in your funding, and if you could just talk about that for a minute, that'd be great. Maybe I'll start with Abbas on this one.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll jump in, and actually, Anna, I'm gonna quote you from one of our previous conversations, and that is that the Supreme Court, hasn't even been able to solve this sort of question for us, and we might approach it from, might approach the problem as one that is daunting and one that is impossible to fix. But even if that's the case, at multiple levels, it should not deter our action, and that's something that you've said, Anna, in the past that I think is really inspiring, and that even if it is complex, it should not slow down our dedication and commitment to depolarizing our society and to looking for solutions and taking action against the harm that has been done, and looking for, sort of restorative and reparative solutions there. And so how do we really navigate that space? First and foremost, we want to center the impacted communities and really not skirt around abstractions like, just hate or extremism. These are concrete realities. White supremacy is a thing. Anti-Black racism is a thing. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism is, these are actual phenomena, and we need to be able to educate ourselves and bring in the impacted communities, experts, and practitioners to help us really, get educated on all of this work. And then we move from there to actually having the more difficult conversation, which is, what are the parameters of the big tent? What is acceptable and what isn't? And we believe that every institution has to define that for themselves in the role that they serve. So a higher educational institution might have a different set of parameters than a community foundation, a different set of parameters than an online social media company, a different set of parameters than a government institution. But really recognizing that there isn't an easy answer to all of this, but there are possibilities, there are solutions, and identifying those in practice, in conversation, has yielded a number of really fruitful opportunities for moving and advancing the conversation. And I will just chime in again that it is the philanthropic space, donor circles, community foundations, that can actually lead the way for the rest of the country, because tech companies are not really doing this because of sort of private business practices. The government doesn't want anything to do with this. So where is it that we really go to for guidance on what is acceptable discourse, what is acceptable discourse, and what is sort of out of bounds? So I'm really eager and excited to think that the foundation space is the way out for us.
Let's add one other thought. There's obviously a line between speech that is hateful, extremist, that incites violence and so forth, and then there's this whole body of speech that is problematic because it is tinged with contempt and disrespect and judgment and certitude, right? It's like the general tenor of political conversation, cultural conversation in this country. And some of the models that I've been taken by are ones that don't try to discourage people from having hard conversations or heated debates and arguments, but to do them more effectively, more productively. One example is an initiative that Eric Liu leads out of the Aspen Institute called the Better Arguments Project. And the premise of the Better Arguments Project is not that we need fewer arguments, but we need better arguments. And by better, he means anchored in, as we've all talked about, a spirit of relationship and goodwill that takes winning off the table, that enables people to bring nuance and complexity into conversations. All things that are easier said than done, to be sure. And yet there are skills and practices and models for enabling people to have better hard conversations and still rumble and debate, but to do so without the contempt and divisiveness and dehumanization, right, that is so problematic when that becomes the norm in our discourse.
Yeah, what you've all said is I think so spot on, and Abbas really, he mentioned that each group gets to define the parameters of its own tent, and I would say the same is true for us as individuals. You know, some among us have really been meaningfully impacted and hold close the harm that is done through speech. And if you aren't ready to go all the way to the different ends of the spectrum, that's okay too. Start with conversations where you're ready to start. You get to define those terms for yourself. And then when you do, lean into it, right? So interrogate those assumptions that you might be making. I try to do that on a daily basis, and it's not always easy, right? To say, okay, do I believe, if you believe this policy or support this position or this group, does that necessarily mean you support this other thing? Why don't I ask about that rather than making the assumption? Why don't I ask and help learn? And I found that when I lean into that, really fruitful conversations have happened. So, you know, in trying to live into this practice for myself, have had some hard conversations with people who I realized after the conversation that we actually weren't as far apart as I thought we were. We might have a different way of solving the same problem, but actually we're both concerned about the problem itself. And so I challenge you to find places in your everyday life, in your everyday work, in your family relationships, neighborhoods, community groups, giving circles, to stay in the conversation. As Jonathan said, you live into the nuance of it and ask questions about why. Seek to understand someone else's perspective before assuming that that they believe one thing or another.
Thank you. Well, we are coming to the end of our session here, and I really want to thank each of you for your insight, wisdom, and just sharing your experiences and stories today. And before we close it out, we have maybe do a quick lightning round. If there's anything else on the tip of your tongue that each of you want to say.
I'll jump in. I think my closing thoughts for you all is that you all are agents of change. That is the beauty and the power of our muting my own self. It's the strength of our democracy as well. And so find ways in your everyday life where you can live into this and where you can bridge divides. That is how systems change will happen here.
Yeah, I echo those sentiments, and just to encourage everyone to embrace bridging as a priority alongside other things you care about. It can be a way of being, a way of approaching your work at a moment when bridging is still, I think, mostly out of favor and countercultural. I think it takes more of us who care about this work to invest in it, to live it, to support it. And just lastly, if you're interested in learning more about the Funder Collaborative that Einhorn's a part of, you can check out our website that just launched, newpluralists.org. New Pluralists is the name of the Funder Collaborative. It includes a group of field leaders doing great work across the space. If you want to learn more about some of the folks researchers, practitioners, storytellers, helping to strengthen a culture of pluralism and bridging in America.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's great, Libby, Jonathan, and Anna, as always, to interface. I will just sort of, my mantra is really to try to empower leaders in philanthropy, not simply, and this is the challenge piece, not simply to promote the good, right? You know, we have to sort of promote the good and kind of work in that direction, but we also have to stop the bad one way or the other. I mean, the things that are harmful, the things that are actually challenging and problematic that we have direct control over, we do need to address those things. And so please consider Horizon Forum a resource to walk through some of these difficult conversations. We have screening tools, and we have sort of, you know, discrete methods of sort of working through policy and through implementation on how you and your foundation might be able to address these challenges. And so I would just encourage everybody that as we're promoting the good, let us also sort of, you know, work against the harmful practices that might exist on our own, you know, on our front doorstep or in our backyard. And so that's my challenge to us as a community. And thank you for letting me be part of this community. It's been a fascinating run for the last couple of years to join this space. So thank you all very much, and thank you for convening us, Anna.
Well, thank you. Thank you all again, and thank you to the audience for joining us today, and to the We Give Summit for all of the incredible conversations and people that are being convened through this conference. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your time, and be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.